Welcome back, everyone, as we continue to talk about the Great War. Though we have completed our series looking at World War I year by year from 1914 to 1918, I promised a while back that at some point we would take a look at the video that we're going to take a look at today. It comes from our friends at the Great War channel and our friend Indy Nidell, who is going to be talking today. The topic is called World War I by the numbers. Now, it's important for us to understand that in any war, but especially in the industrialized wars like World War I, World War II, that for every person that is on the front lines fighting, there is an army of people behind the lines making it possible for that person to fight. And I don't just mean the people on the home front who are working in factories to produce the materials and the supplies that are necessary, but I'm talking about all of the logistics in getting those supplies to the front line. To be honest, one of the things that made Ulysses S. Grant such an incredible general during the American Civil War was that he understood better than most, I think, the importance of supply. And he talks a lot about that in his autobiography on his time in the American Civil War. He talks about the incredible number of troops that are needed just to supply the armies at the front line and how deceiving it can be when you look at the numbers. So, for example, when you look at the number of men at a given battle, that doesn't mean there were that many men available to fight, because you had to have people guarding supply lines, you had to have people responsible for transporting those supplies to the front lines, you had to have people that were there to feed the armies, to take care of the horses, all of these sorts of things. And this is absolutely true in the First World War. For every man you've got in the trench on the front lines, there's a massive amount of work that goes into keeping them there. And that's what this video is all about. So join with me as we dive in to World War I in numbers.
The scale of the First World War was so large that it was often difficult to gauge. Now, I talk a lot about the numbers of the dead, the wounded, even the refugees. But today, I'm going to throw some other numbers at you to help get some more perspective. Not numbers of people, numbers of things. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode of The Great War in Numbers. The destructive power of the technologies used in the First World War was devastating like never before in history, and this power increased exponentially as the war went on. In no area was this more obvious than in the use of artillery. Artillery was comparatively rudimentary at the beginning of the war, but the continued development of gun design, ranging technology, counter barrages, tactical deployment, and the innovations in artillery design all contributed to increase the deadly efficiency of artillery. But what really increased the body count was the enormous increase in the sheer amount of artillery.
So, why is artillery so vital to the First World War? Well, as things settle into trench warfare, and you realize the insanity of hurling huge numbers of men at the front lines, especially when they've got things like barbed wire and multiple trench lines and machine guns. You've got to have a way of softening up those targets. And that's been a philosophy throughout warfare. But now in particular, when you've got so much work going into protecting your defensive position, you have to increasingly get more creative with the ways and the amount of artillery that you use. And oh my gosh, the numbers are just massive. We talked about this the other day. At the Battle of Verdun, the Germans, on a very small front, amassed 2.5 million artillery shells just for the initial bombardment. They fire 1 million shells on the first day alone on maybe a 20-mile front, maybe even less than that. And that was only like 1,200 artillery pieces that were firing those. It wasn't like they had 20,000 guns that were firing those shells. It was 1,200 of them that were firing 1 million shells in one day. It was non-stop. That's a lot of artillery. That's a lot of explosive firepower that takes a lot of logistics to make happen.
For example, at Champagne and Artois in 1915, the French expended 8 million shells over 2 months along a 50-kilometer front. That's about 30 miles. Over a similar time span, a similar 2-month time span, 2 years later, at Chemin des Dames, the French poured 19 million shells into a 40-kilometer front, only 25 miles. The Battle of Verdun, however, has become famous, or infamous, for the heavy use of artillery. The German plan was to shell the French into oblivion, and to prepare for that, the German army amassed enough ammunition to fire 2 million shells from 1,200 guns in only 6 days, and a further 2 million shells in the ensuing 12 days. Now this required, as you might imagine, a huge amount of preparation. In the lead up to battle, over 30 trains a day were scheduled to offload shells behind the German lines. The battle began on February 21st, 1916, with roughly 1 million shells being fired into the French lines during just a 10-hour bombardment.
Can you even wrap your mind around something like that? 1 million shells in 10 hours? So what's that, 100,000 shells an hour? Fired by, let's say that all 1,200 guns are going for that. So let's just do a little math here. So you have 1,200 guns, assuming they were all firing. That's 83 shells an hour per gun. So that's almost 1.5 shells a minute for 10 hours for each gun. And I'm sure they took breaks, so it was probably a higher rate of fire than that.
As the battle raged on, artillery bombardment became the norm and became increasingly intense. Between August 11th and August 20th, so just 10 days, the French army fired 3 million shells into an area only 4 kilometers by half a kilometer. So just 2.5 miles by just over 500 yards.
2.5 miles, 3 million shells. I'm just going to keep crunching numbers here because, you know, it's sometimes easier to break down those numbers to get a sense of the intensity of it. So 2.5 miles. So that's 1.2 million shells per mile in 10 days. So let's break that down further. 5,280 feet. That's 227 shells for every foot of the front. 227 shells for every foot of the front. Now, granted, it goes back a ways. How did anybody stand up over that? You know, my wife and I were watching a video this morning on shell shock in World War I. She's her area of expertise is in psychology and things like that, and so we were studying that a little bit because I was trying to get a better sense of that. It's an incredible wonder to me that any person came out of that kind of shelling and was able to function in society at all,
wreaking havoc on the German operations and supply lines. By the time the battle ended, it is estimated that as many as 65 million shells were used by the French and German armies. And
I think the number I read, something like 20% of all of those shells that are fired were duds, which means they were unexploded and on the battlefield, which is why they have these red zones in France where you're not allowed to occupy, you're not allowed to live there, you can't farm there. And it's why people continue to die. World War I, probably more than any other war in history, is responsible for continuing to kill people 100 years later. And we're going to talk about this when I go to France. How there are these places where people still find live shells and they leave them on the side of the road for the French army to come and collect. When you're talking about these kinds of numbers and the failure rate of those, you can think about just how many there've got to still be on the battlefield.
That 75% of the over 700,000 casualties were caused by artillery fire. Of course, staggering numbers are not just limited to weaponry. With millions of soldiers in the field, you also had logistics and supply problems like none ever seen before. By 1915, the Western Front stretched roughly 1,000 kilometers, like 600 miles, from the Swiss border to the North Sea. Millions of men held both sides of the line in trench networks, fortifications, dugouts, fortresses, redoubts, and holes in the ground, right? In addition to providing shells and armaments for soldiers along the Western Front, which was no small feat, the logistical branch of each army had to consider the supply of everyday necessities and services for all these men in what were, in reality, mobile towns and even mobile cities all along the line. Now here's an example. In 1917, the Canadian Corps was holding a 6-kilometer portion of the Western Front before the Battle of Arras. That's it, just 6 kilometers, like 4 miles. But this single corps holding that fraction of the front included 97,184 Canadians, along with a British division in reserve. With support staff and services, a total of 170,000 men were engaged there, right?
So just that number alone tells you something. 170,000 men, only half of whom were combatants on the front line. The rest are support. So for every man on the front, you've got at least one more man who's also present at that section of the battlefield as support staff. And that doesn't count all the people that are further back.
Right. To put this in context, if that group was in Canada in 1917, it would have been the 3rd largest city in Canada after Montreal and Toronto. In addition to supplying ammunition for 100,000 soldiers and 983 artillery pieces, systems for food, water, transport, medical services, communications, engineering, entertainment, training grounds, billets, and general infrastructure had to be developed and maintained. Behind the trench networks, this operations area stretched for over 10 kilometers. Now, to supply these operations and to facilitate transport, engineers built or improved 50 kilometers, 30 miles, of roads and maintained it on a daily basis as the roads were constantly being battered down.
50 kilometers of roads for 4 miles of front. And, you know, there's a great example of this. You have the Sacred Road, which was the one road into the area around Verdun for the French during that battle, that just 24 hours a day had a convoy like this of trucks pouring into it to keep the men supplied. And if a truck broke down, they shoved it to the side of the road because there couldn't be a break in that constant road supply network being, just things coming down. 50 kilometers for 4 kilometers of front.
Because of the heavy traffic and the constant bombardment, much of the roads were built up with wood, forming double-lane plank roadways to support supply and rear assembly areas. The Canadian Corps Light Railway built and maintained a 20-kilometer-mile-long tramway system that brought shells forward by night and was designed to transport thousands of wounded men to clearing stations once the battle began. Now, these narrow-gauge rail lines ran into some of the 13 subways that were dug 8 meters, 26 feet, underground into the chalk bedrock along the front line. Totaling 12 kilometers in length, the parallel subways that led right up to no man's land were to be used for troop movements before the battle. They were outfitted with telephone communications. Most had electrical lighting, and the longest subway had a water main that helped bring some of the 600,000 gallons or 2.3 million liters of water that was needed at the front every day.
And once again, perspective. This is not the entire front. This is not a large section of the front. This is 4 miles of a 600-mile long front that required this. Where they were getting all of this just blows my mind, completely blows my mind, how they were able to keep this all supplied.
For the soldiers and the 50,000 horses and mules used by the Corps. The water system included 21 pumping stations and over 70 kilometers of pipeline. In order to fulfill an ever-increasing need for wood for these roads, railways, as well as duckboards and tunnel supports, forestry companies erected mobile sawmills behind the Canadian lines.
And this is why one of the things you'll notice when I go to France is how different the photos that you'll see are from the battlefield today. And the same thing was true when I went to Vicksburg. When you go to Vicksburg today, there's trees everywhere, but there were no trees in any of the photos that you see because there was such a need for wood, even just for firewood, let alone for all the other needs that they would have had for wood. You know, they're building these mines underneath that needed to be supported by wood. They're building, dugouts in the ground to protect themselves against the shelling. All of this. So there was no tree anywhere on these battlefields in the areas where the entrenchments lasted for more than a few weeks.
Supplying over 30,000 meters, 100,000 feet, of rough planking every week. communication systems were built both above ground and below, with 1,800 kilometers of telephone wire being laid in tunnels and across the trench system used by that Canadian Corps.
1,800 kilometers of telephone wire for 6 kilometers of front. 300 kilometers of telephone wire for every kilometer of front.
Most of this infrastructure was built over a 6-month period. Once the Battle of Arras forced the German line back, each headquarters and each unit attached to the Canadian Corps had to reorganize and move operations forward. The logistical process of relocating hospitals, headquarters, stores, supply depots, kitchens, batteries, and the like, and building the requisite infrastructure as new lines were established was time-consuming and labor-intensive.
And so, I mean, think about that. The whole purpose of your fighting, right, is to take ground from the enemy. I mean, you're wanting to push the lines back, but every time you do that, you have to do all of this over again. Even if you just move the line 2 miles forward, you've got to do a lot of this over again. It boggles the mind.
Was also crucial to military operations. I want you to bear in mind that all of this, all I've just said over the last 2 or 3 minutes, was to supply a little more than half of 1% of the trench lines on one side. Supply on the German side, well, on any side, was just as complicated. The food requirement alone was pretty mind-blowing. I'm going to give you the next few numbers in pounds, right? 2 pounds is a bit less than a kilo, just for your reference. In the First World War, Holger H. Herwig notes that in 1 month, a German unit of 35,000 men would consume 1 million pounds of meat, 600,000 loaves of bread, 242,000 pounds of canned meat, 121,000 pounds of marmalade, and 73,000 pounds of coffee. The horses of that same unit would need 7 million pounds of oats and over 4 million pounds of hay.
And this is all for the army of a nation that is being blockaded. The fact that they held out for 4 years while having a very, very difficult time even importing the goods that they needed is a small miracle. This is what was needed for 35,000 men and an army of millions spread out on 2, 3 fronts, 4 fronts, when you count Italy and the Balkans and these other places, in a nation that's being blockaded.
Herwig also notes that the 18th Army Corps reported that in 1 month, Corps butchers had slaughtered 1,320 cows, 1,100 hogs, and 4,158 sheep to meet the food requirements of the men. So, extrapolated from them to the entire German army, in 1 week, the army needed 60 million pounds of bread, 131 million pounds of potatoes, and over 17 million pounds of meat.
In 1 week.
I thought you guys might like a quick look at a small variety of the staggering numbers that aren't just related to the killing of millions of young men. Well, I lie. All of the numbers are related to the killing of millions of young men. And the bigger the numbers, the greater the killing. Thanks a lot to Ryan Gallant, who had the idea for this episode and did most of the research for us. If you like that idea, let us know in the comments, and we'll see if we can come up with some more numbers for World War I.
Awesome. As always, you know how much I love Indy and the way he tells a story, which I think he just does a phenomenal job of presenting the information in a compelling way. I got a book I ordered a month ago that finally came. And I wasn't sure how well it was going to show up because it's got green on it, and the green screen will throw that up. But this is called The Battlefield Companion of the Somme, 1916. It's actually produced by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in England. So I'm excited to dive into this. It's going to be my main source of information when I get to my 2.5 days at the Somme battlefield. So excited to bring that to you. As always, let me know in the comment section below something you learned that you didn't know before. From this video, or let us know something else related to this topic that maybe you'd like to share so we can all learn together. Please hit that like button if you would. I'll put a link in the description to the original content if you want to watch that same video without my commentary and check out some of their hundreds of fantastic videos on the topic of the Great War. Thanks for watching.